Alrighty, Matt. Can you start, partly for my benefit, by just walking us through the basics of what is happening to the physical environment that we're in at higher altitudes?
So, as we know, when we go up in altitude, the pressure drops. And that means that all the oxygen molecules are further apart. There's the same percentage of oxygen, but every time you take a breath in, you get fewer oxygen molecules in each breath. So, the key problem that we associate with altitude is that when you get higher, there's less oxygen. But there's lots of other stuff as well that we know about, like it's much colder, you travel through the air faster, and there's also more solar radiation. So this all has implications for how we protect ourselves and also the decisions we make when we fly.
And how does that altitude exposure that we have in paragliding compared to other sports?
So a lot of this is kind of a time dependent thing. So we all know about altitude sickness, as outdoorsy people from a mountaineering perspective. And that's something that tends to come on after kind of 6 to 8 hours. And, you hike up slowly and then, you're sitting in the tea house or whatever, and you start to feel short of breath or headachy or all of these other symptoms of altitude illness. Equally, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got something like a fighter plane that kind of explosively decompresses and suddenly the person's unconscious. And the really interesting thing about paragliding is that it sits somewhere between the two. Like we get up to these really high altitudes, but we do so without exercising. And we also do so on a time scale that is usually not long enough for classical mountain sickness, but is not so short that we just kind of black out like you would if you just immediately decompressed.
And what are the expected symptoms of a standard individual who is exposed to altitude in that way without any prior acclimatization or necessary equipment?
Because we sit in this middle ground between immediate and long term, it's quite variable from person to person. But the things that we would expect is um, a feeling of breathing a bit more rapidly, a headache, a dry mouth, and subtle cognitive impairment. So it might be that either decisions feel a little bit more difficult or thinking becomes a bit more rigid. We're not so good at like thinking expansively, thinking strategically. And what was really interesting to me was that I really felt that um, when we'll talk more about the oxygen systems, but we had oxygen systems that came on above a certain altitude, and before they came on, I I felt that I was getting quite task focused and quite myopic, and perhaps a little bit not quite pessimistic, maybe a little bit fatalistic when I was in the air. And then when the oxygen came on, suddenly I felt a bit more upbeat, bit more engaged, a bit more like I could make better and more thoughtful decisions. And those subtle changes in kind of cognition and emotion are what we would expect in those altitudes.
How does that all tie in with the research that's been done in the field?
Of the paragliding specific research, that's stuff that I've mostly done, and I did that in a few ways. The first was in the early expeditions of Tom Dodolo and Horacio Lorenz. They kindly took some oxygen monitors and did some symptom questionnaires for me. And then later on, I built a simulator in the University of Portsmouth lab where sat in a pod harness and went on a simulated 2.5 hour flight up to 3,600 meters. And in that flight, we simulated the low oxygen, the cold, and also the headwind, and did various cognitive tests. Now, the fun part was before we did the official testing in a group of pilots, I did a sort of slightly more extreme version to see what that felt like. And what I discovered is that when I become profoundly hypoxic, I start using the word rad a lot. So it's kind of Gavin McClurg's disease. Um, and yeah, so I suffer from like a serious case of the McClurgs. It makes you realize that subtle things like vocabulary or the sort of place in your emotions where you sit are so manipulable by your environment.
That's really quite brilliant. So to save me from catching the McClurgs, secondhand through the radio from you. Can you can you walk us through the equipment that we use to avoid the impacts of altitude exposure?
So if we think of the three big problems as oxygen, cold, and solar radiation. So in terms of the solar radiation stuff, that was more of a concern for you, I think, than for me with my lovely Middle Eastern heritage. But we managed to do that with sun cream and decent goggles. The cold stuff was with a big old jacket, which hopefully you get to try on. Many geese suffered for our pleasure. And that was very effective. In fact, it was so effective that we both realized we'd been a lot colder in Scotland than we had been in the Karakoram. And actually, the biggest problem was how hot we were on launch. So that was a kind of unexpected environmental factor. Like I didn't think that heat was going to be such an issue. And then um, oxygen is obviously the last and the big one. And so we solve that through supplemental oxygen. And the system again was of like geeky interest to me and then practical interest when we actually did it. But we had a small bottle filled with what we hope was oxygen. It came from a welding shop, which is usually a good sign because they need oxygen to weld properly. Um, but the cylinders were not sort of fully full. So some gas that contained some oxygen. And then that was attached to a regulator that meant we got a pulse of oxygen through nasal cannulae, little tubes in the nose, every time we breathed in once we were above an altitude of 5,000 meters.
What are the worst case scenarios if it all goes wrong and the equipment fails at that altitude for you?
I guess there's a few ways that this has gone wrong historically. So some of the early reports came out of the Nepali flying community, and there, people were flying quite high, sometimes unexpectedly. And there was one kind of quite memorable case where a guy went blind in the air and had to be talked down on radio by one of his pals and was fine. And what probably happened there is that the eye is a very high demand organ. And so when he became hypoxic, he the eye is you often sort of get tunnel vision, but obviously he had enough to lose his vision. And then I suspect he was so panicky that even though it should have come back pretty quickly, either it didn't or he felt it didn't when he was coming into land. But it was, that's a sort of salient example of something that can happen in midair. Other stuff that would worry me beyond lapses of judgment or concentration would be if someone was to get stranded. So when you look at uh, Antoine Girard and the guys who are doing para-alpinism, who are landing up high, if we were to have landed out or landed up high, then we suddenly become mountaineers. And so we would then be spending hours, potentially days at that altitude unacclimatized. And then the big worry is kind of common or garden altitude sickness. But to go that high and just get dropped off up there puts you in a vulnerable position because most people who get altitude sickness have to have trekked up there and have to have taken some time. Um, and so the worry would then be developing pulmonary edema fluid in the lungs or cerebral edema fluid on the brain.
And just as a last question, I remember you were pretty fascinated by other pilots' approaches to acclimatization or lack thereof, so that they didn't have to take supplementary oxygen. Can you walk through what was going on there
So
from the
yeah, we
boys?
saw a few interesting acclimatization strategies. We were there. We saw a couple of people who just didn't believe in it, and others who took, I guess, a really interesting approach to acclimatization, which paragliding allows us to do and other sports probably don't, which is flying up, landing high, spending the night, because most acclimatization occurs at night. So spending the night and then flying down and resting and recovering for a couple of days, getting their sleep back, getting their strength back, eating properly, and then doing that again and again. And that's not been well studied, but it makes a lot of physiological sense and it seemed to work for them. And so, again, if I didn't do the full tent, that would be another kind of quite interesting approach, would be a structured night high, 2 nights down low, night high, 2 nights down low. The I guess the limiting factor for that for me was I came away thinking I need to be much better at top landing than I am. Like we both successfully top landed, but it took us a little while of like generally generally bobbing around, going, oh, not now. Ah, maybe not now, maybe in 20 minutes. And I think being able to kind of really stick a top landing is what I would need to have in my bag if I was to sort of confidently acclimatize.